You're listening to STU'S Show on Shocus Internet Radio. From Chatsworth, California, Shocus Internet Radio presents STU'S Show. 2 hours of terrific conversation with great personalities from the world of television, both in front of and behind the cameras, plus your live phone calls. And now, here's the host of STU'S Show, Stu Shostak.
Bernie, now, as a young boy, 4, 5, 6 years old, did you get to go to the studio and watch them draw and do all this kind of neat stuff?
I did. My dad would take me there in the summertime when I was out of school. And he would sit me at a moviola and give me a bunch of NG film and teach me how to cut film, actually.
Wow.
There. And I enjoyed it a lot. And the studio was a very interesting place. It was wacky. You know, the first of all, the Fleischers were all nuts anyway. And,
you can say that. You're entitled to say that.
And it was just a crazy atmosphere and lots of fun. I really enjoyed going to the studio.
But you never did get to sit in on any of the voice sessions or anything like that, because those were all... Well, are you talking about the Miami years, or did you visit them in New York,
I visited them in New York. I'm talking now about 1600 Broadway.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably, since when you were older and you were down there in Miami, it must have been super cool back down there.
Oh, it was... yeah, that was very interesting because I was there a lot during the setup of the Miami studio.
When Jerry Beck was on the show last year, we talked a lot about Popeye, but I certainly cannot avoid that here. We have to discuss Popeye. How did the Popeye character was first introduced in a Betty Boop cartoon, correct?
Right.
And they acquired the rights. Was it Paramount that got the rights, or was it the Fleischers
It was Fleischer Studios. Max negotiated the license with King Features. One thing, he had an advantage, again, coming out of the cartoonist circles. These people knew each other. And he originally negotiated that license in November of 1932. And he was introduced in the Betty Boop series. That was the pilot, so to speak. And, of course, Popeye took off.
Well, blow me down.
And so suddenly that was the most valuable property that they had.
Out-surpassing Disney, right?
Eventually, because Mickey Mouse was becoming a little too mild. But getting back to that, though, Popeye also represented the next dramatic point in Fleischer Studios' history. First, we had the Betty Boop lawsuit. So you could pretty much figure that was the apex of the Betty Boop story. Because from that point on, her importance is not the same. Right. Popeye is the important character. And the continued success of Popeye led to the next level of development, which Bernie witnessed. Paramount was, I guess it would be fair to say that they were greedy in the fact that they wanted more and more Popeyes to be produced and not allowing enough time and money to do them right. Now, at the same time, the curiosity is, since Max was the head of the studio and he was in the best position because he was the one who had the license, why didn't he say, why don't we just cut production so that we can channel this time and money into making the cartoons better and do them right? They had Betty Boop, they had the color classics, they had the screen songs, which actually were cheaper to produce, and then Popeye was the premier one, and all the efforts went into that.
One thing that I'm sure your audience will understand, being a lot of animation insiders, is that when Paramount said that they wanted 2 Popeye cartoons instead of just 1 for every time period, Fleischer Studios actually had to add another studio. They had to take over another floor of the building, bring in a whole new set of people, and I'm sure that contributed a little bit to quality short cuts and
this
corners
also
being
contributed
cut.
with the 1937 strike.
That's what we're getting up to, and
Yeah.
there were 2 things that led to that. The increased popularity and demand on Popeye, and it's almost like Popeye brought about the strike, but that's a secondary thing. But Fleischer's was expanding at the time when Van Buren closed its doors, and Van Buren, which was across the street, was under RKO. And in late 1936, RKO got the Disney distribution contract. So they no longer had a reason to operate this studio, and there were a lot of problems that had already existed when Burt Gillette was running Van Buren those last few years. So a lot of those hard feelings were carried over, and when these people went over to Fleischer's, there had already been talk about organizing over at Van Buren anyway, so they just kept fighting this battle over there, and then they were also disgruntled about the fact that they weren't hired in at the same level that they were at Van Buren. But in all fairness, they were hired in wherever there was an opening.
They were lucky to get jobs, and they were lucky that at the time Van Buren went out, Fleischer was expanding. Do you remember the strike?
Oh, yes.
Oh yes, not a pleasant period, I would say, for your family, sir.
An interesting period. If you recall, I said that my dad would bring me to the studio during the summertime when I was out of school, and I remember one day we walked up to 1600 Broadway, and there were people parading in front of the building with picket signs, and I didn't know what they were, and my dad asked me to just wait by another storefront for a minute while he went over and talked to the strikers, the picketers. And he went over and he spoke with them a bit, and I noticed some flash photography and stuff going on. And my dad came back to me and he said, Bernie said, we're going to go to the zoo today. Well, actually, the planetarium. He said, we're going to the planetarium. He said, I said, what's wrong? And he said, we'll talk about it later. He said, but I'm not going into work. And so it was really something, because people thought that all the Fleischer brothers were owners of the studio, and actually only two were. My dad was not an owner, but his picture appeared on the front page of the New York Times the next day. Owner refuses to cross own picket line. Which was a very...
Wow, I wonder what kind of dissension that caused with Max and Dave.
That caused a procession of limousines to our little house in Sheepshead Bay. Not Sheepshead Bay, we were living near Brighton Beach, a place called Manhattan Beach in New York, in a very small house. And all of a sudden, every night there were limousines in front of the house, and Paramount people, and my uncles Max and Dave were there, and actually it held up all production at the studio, because every bit of film that came out of Fleischer Studios at some point went through my father's hands.
Yeah.
As far as editing and cutting and syncing up and all of that. And he refused to go into work. He was a member of the Musicians Union.
Sure, so sympathizing.
And in sympathy with the animators, he would absolutely not cross the picket line. And they put tremendous pressure on him as part of the family to come back in, and he never did.
Wow, he held his ground. Good for him.
He held his ground the whole time.
Good for him. How did this get resolved?
Well,
and how long did it last?
It went on for 5 months.
5 months seems to be the magic number with lawsuits and strikes with the Fleischer family.
But the thing that's interesting, though, is that what started out as a strike among artists, there was also a refusal to recognize that group, which came under the Commercial Artists and Designers Union, CADU. And just previous to that, the industry had agreed to recognize the IA.
Okay.
And so Paramount was also telling Max, don't even recognize these people. So in a lot of respects, Paramount was actually telling Max how to run this, which it sort of seems like they were playing both ends of it, because what happened was it escalated into a boycott because the IA projectionists refused to run any Paramount cartoons.
Wow. Now, they had a backlog at this point, right? They were a little bit
had
ahead.
something of a backlog, but the cartoons weren't being run.
Yeah.
And they even had plants in the theaters. If one that was already in release was on the screen, they would boo it off the screen.
To be forced to shut it down.
It was more than booing. There were stink bombs in the theaters.
Oh, my.
And, yeah.
Oh, my.
All kinds
so
of
what
stuff.
finally happened? Who sat down and who negotiated this, and what was the outcome?
They finally resolved it in late October of 1937. And then they got back on schedule. Interestingly, the release that finally initiated the regular release of their cartoons again was the two-reeler Alabama in November of 1937.
Open sesame! Open what? Open
Hey,
it!
wait for me, wait for me. Oh, I wonder what that word was he used when he opened this door. Open, sissy. Open, Cecil. Oh, that can't be it, huh? Oh, it's giving way, it's giving way. Oh, that was me that was giving way, huh? Whoa, well. There's a violation for not having no exit that you can go into, huh? Oh, it's quite modernistic, I'll tell you that right now, huh? I hope this isn't a one-way street. Tippy-do, tippy-do, tippy-do. I gotta give all these jewels back to the people. Tippy-do, tippy-do, tippy-do. I hope I see them before they see me. Tippy-do, tippy-do, tippy-do. Ooh, what's that noise, huh? Whoa. Olive.
Yashi.
Gashi.
Yashi. Rashi. Shashi.
Must be thieves around here.
Oh, boy, now's makes sense. Hey, you gotta give back all them jewels to the people you took. Oh, hello, Wimpy. How did you get in here, you fella?
Hey, outside you!
Oh, this wash is getting heavier and heavier, and I oh, Popeye! My darling, my sweetheart!
Hey, out you go!
Hey, what is this, a wishing well or something? I wish I was out of this place, that's what I wish, huh? Oh, just a little flounder, that's all. A little snapper, that's all. Hey, you're liable to hurt your teeth, huh? Whoa. Oh, yeah. Boy, somebody's gonna be sorry for this. That'll hold you. Open sesame.
One time, fire! Hobby Dobby, Hobby Nobby, Hobby Dobby, Hobby Nobby, go!
Oh, yeah. Step right up, boy. One at a time, yeah? Line up, get right in line up. How do you... Hey, how'd you like to go for a little ride, huh? Here we go. Rubber go.
Two time, fire!
Blue boy, take that control. 40. Here I am. Over here. Make a move.
Come out here. Where you be?
Here I am. Over here. I see you. Everyone.
Come out here.
Oh, yeah? There. Five, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. Oh, yeah? How does that strike you? Socko. Thank you. Shorty, but I lick the 40. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
Disney came out with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For years, Max had argued with Paramount about doing an animated feature, and it fell on deaf ears, right? For the most part. They acquiesced with the first Popeye cartoon, Sinbad the Sailor, right? But that was a two-reeler. It was 18 minutes long, and it did very well for them, did it not?
Well, it was even advertised as a Popeye feature, and the appearance is that maybe Max wasn't quite as aggressive in jumping into a full-length feature. That isn't quite it. Again, he was under the control of Paramount, and Paramount said no. Now, he wanted to do it as early as 1934. They had a lot of interesting properties that they could have considered. In fact, at that time, Paramount owned Peter Pan. That had been considered. They had considered doing a story called Neptune's Daughter, which Disney ended up doing as Little Mermaid. The Bluebird was another consideration. And Gulliver's Travels was picked because it was a favorite story of Max's. And he reached a point because of a lot of these frustrations about having things vetoed and so forth, and also because of the strike. He finally figured, we want to get out of New York, we want to move forward. And I think at this point they were starting to feel the effect that Disney was having. And quite frankly, their cartoons were not progressing artistically, again, because of the constraints they had because of the money. So at heart, there were a lot of basically good reasons for trying to go into a new environment to improve.
A new environment both in the world of cartoons and moving to Miami.
That's correct.
Okay.
But the plan was ill-fated on a lot of levels. Gulliver was pressed into production, but primarily because of the proven success of Snow White. So suddenly Paramount had a change of heart, and they gave him 18 months to produce the thing when Disney already had it in development for at least 3 years, and the actual production was within the last year. They had 18 months from development to getting it on the screen, and it was very rushed.
Now,
and you add to this the fact that they were relocating.
Right, let's talk about that. What was the reason that you guys wanted to move to Florida, Bernie?
The reason that I got was just that Max and Dave loved Miami. They really loved it. And they felt that they could develop Miami into another film center, just like Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And they got a lot of support from the city. There were tax breaks, there were special considerations that were given because the city of Miami really welcomed the studio into its heart.
The building is still there.
Yes,
what
it is.
was the building before? Paramount owned the building. Paramount bought the building for the Fleischers.
No. It was originally built for that.
Oh, it was built for. So Max had the building built.
It was specifically designed for the production of animated cartoons.
It was, and it was interesting because it was right at the edge of the Everglades at that time.
Whoa!
And now, of course, that's the center of the city.
Yeah.
But at that time, they actually had to build and fight off wild animals,
alligators coming up. Wow!
And lions. And
did you go down there and watch them build the building?
Yes.
Oh, how cool was that? So
yeah, it was I think if I recall, it was a tilt-up kind of.
It was poured
building.
concrete.
It was poured concrete and then tilted up into position, and it was a beautiful studio for that era. And of course, it was such a change from New York. 1600 Broadway was a grimy old building. And of course, whatever facilities they had in New York were office facilities that were just used for animation. And this was just absolutely spotless and gorgeous, and it stretched over many acres. It was almost like a campus, and it was ideal for animated cartoons.
They had their own soundstage, too.
For recording.
Yes.
But they still did the recording in the New York?
Part of the trouble was that Max and Dave were running the show and so forth, and they just wanted to be down there. The bad planning about that is that by leaving New York, you're leaving behind your talent pool. And that's one of the things that stands out about what they did in New York, and you can immediately tell the changeover because the quality of the music deteriorated immediately.
And it was very noticeable. They were using people from the university there, which had a good music department, but the films had been scored by the top studio musicians in New York, and they could not get that kind of quality.
Tell them some of the famous people even sat in some of the sessions.
Yeah, they're Benny Goodman and the Dorsey brothers. They were among the artists who played on those sessions.
And they probably figured it was a privilege to be in a Popeye cartoon or whatever they happened to be working. Now
they were just studio musicians at the time.
Why didn't you sing, Grandma?
Well, I thought of that, but I wanted to give me a little talent break. You know me.
And they could not get that kind of quality, so they went back to New York to record.
And two things right off the bat. Gulliver's Travels, we just was saying during the break, this is the first I've heard of this. The soundtrack was actually recorded out here in Hollywood.
Well, we're talking about recording the score.
Oh, the score.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And the other thing, too, is when they moved down to Miami, then they started to conform to the formal process that everybody else was doing, where you get into more pre-recorded things and then you do mixes.
Right, we were talking those early Popeyes.
And that was the difference between what they were doing in New York and what happened later, in the fact that everything was done post-sync, where you had everything set up with open mics that were a live mix. It was set up like a radio show, and what you ended up with was a first-generation recording, a live recording of everything. But everybody else was doing separate tracks at that time. You had the voice that was recorded in advance, and it would be analyzed. And then by the time the cartoon was put together, then they would go through and then they would score afterward and then do the mix. And that's eventually what was happening when they went down to Miami, especially when they started to do the feature. So when they came to doing the music, of course, it was a Paramount feature release, and they had their policies about how their scores would be recorded, so it was naturally recorded on the West Coast.
Gotcha. Now, this was the start of the Fleischers. Their move was actually, they thought it would be great for them, but actually this was the start of their deficit with Paramount, right? What's the story with Gulliver's Travels? Did it make money? I heard it was a tremendous flop, but not as big of a flop as Mr. Bug was, but it did not make the money that everybody expected. What's the real story there?
Well, first of all, it initially made back the money that it was originally budgeted at. The problem is that they went $400,000 over budget. They had managers, and they okayed these overages because they just took it for granted that they would just make up that difference in the foreign releases. But what happened in September, just 3 months before it was released, was that war started out with the invasion of Poland. And it's always been assumed that Gulliver never had a foreign release, and that's why they didn't get back that $400,000. It's been recorded for years, for the last 30 years that I've been involved with this story, until I had the evidence that proves that that was not true. For you visit the Internet Movie Database, and the Swedish premiere is registered as April 26, 1940. The Danish, May 17, 1940, and the Finnish, September 1st, 1940.
So Paramount withheld information
claiming that they didn't make the money back. All the time that they were doing the shorts, Paramount was financing the shorts, and the shorts made money. his business plan was not complete because he was too comfortable continuing to rely on Paramount. He did not have to do it that way. First of all, why did he continue to go to Paramount for financing? Why didn't he seek the financing from a bank? But he didn't do that. If he was going to continue with Paramount, then why not set it up as a chattel mortgage for the feature only?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It sounds like he just had some bad business advisors around him.
He didn't have any. He was confident and mesmerized that everything would be fine.
Yeah. You have to realize, too, that at that time, their lifestyle had changed. In Miami, they were celebrities. Max had a gorgeous, gorgeous home on Indian River Creek Drive, right next to Al Capone's, who Al was already incarcerated, but that was still a bit of prestige.
Yeah.
And they, I think, lost focus on the business. Dave, probably not quite as much, but they were moving in different circles than they did when they had been in New York.
And Dave and Max started to bicker about things going on outside of business.
Well, it was starting just before they went down there. Shortly after the strike was settled is when the problem started. It's a complicated thing, but basically what I can tell you is that Max wanted the license on Popeye to expire. He didn't want to keep on going with that.
Why would that be when that's the most successful thing they had?
Right. Well, that's almost the basis of the one part of the argument. Max wanted to do more serious films. And Dave said, what do you want to do that for? Well, it's the comedy films that are making the money, that are successful, that have made you rich, which I've worked very hard to put you in that position. So you can see that could be the basis of an argument right there. Then they get into an argument about who was the most important person there, who was the guiding spirit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
This is like two little kids fighting over a candy bar.
Essentially it. That's correct.
Exactly.
That's absolutely it.
And what do you remember about this period? What was your dad's take on this?
Well, the dinner table conversation got pretty dark about the relationships. And at this point, one of the brothers, Charles, had had enough of it. And he left to have his own business because he just couldn't stand the tension.
Wow.
And my dad was trying to calm things down. The other brother, Joe, who did a lot of the electrical work and everything for the studio.
Camera repair, too.
Camera repair, all kinds of stuff, was very bitter. A lot of people felt that Dave wanted to keep producing funny cartoons. Max considered himself much more of an intellectual, and he had grandiose ideas about intellectual films that he wanted to produce.
All of a sudden, after 20-some-odd years of doing these wonderful cartoons...
Well, it's not just that. I mean, he had done a couple of scientific films in the silent days, and I think because he had a chance to rub elbows with an assistant to Einstein, and they also did one on relativity and so forth, that affected him.
You know, psychologically, this may be why he let himself have such a crappy deal with the studio. It's maybe like, if I let myself have a crappy deal, I can stop producing these cartoons and get into something I want to do. Maybe there was an underlying feeling in there that never came to surface. That's why he let everything go into disarray. I don't know. I'm not trying to be Sigmund Freud here.
That doesn't seem to be logical, because why would you completely let everything go, which is what had happened
Well,
anyway.
I know. You've read me portions of that contract. It is ridiculous the way Paramount had him by the balls. Everything.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Well, Dave ended up quitting well before Paramount took him over, right? Dave had enough and left and went over
Actually, Paramount had already taken them over. And this coincides with the cost overruns on Gulliver. Now, here's the crucial thing. There was a contract renewal in May, and there's an indication that there was a contract that was signed on the 19th of May, and 6 days later there was an amended contract that came back. Now, this is the difference. There was something that happened during the course of that 6 days. That was that period where Paramount said that there's still this $400,000 in the red on the books. And Gulliver had been in release for 17 months, and it had not been recovered. So in this amended contract that was supposed to be for 26 weeks, that's 6 months, Max and Dave were convinced that if they surrendered their stock to Paramount for 6 months, that this $400,000 would be recouped and then they would get their ownership returned to them.
Yeah.
And Max and Dave were employees at that point.
Yeah, and they didn't even know it.
When they surrendered their stock, guess who controls the voting rights?
Paramount.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So there you go.
And not only that, but there was allocations for funds set up in a special Fleischer Studios account maintained by Paramount. And so when it was coming up about them losing money, how in the world could they suddenly be losing money when they had one of the most popular animated series that also falls into the history of comedy films of all time?
Yes.
And they're suddenly losing money.
Yes.
So why didn't Max call for an audit? You know why he didn't? Because he didn't want to offend Paramount.
You agree with that?
Well, I don't know nearly as much as Ray has gone
I know, he's amazing.
into the documents. He knows so much more about my family than I do. But I know that one day my father came home and he said, "It's over." And I said, "What do you mean?" We were having dinner and he said, "It's over. The studio's over." And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, Max has sent a telegram to Paramount stating that he will, after a certain date, he will no longer work with Dave Fleischer. And my dad said, that's a severe abrogation of our contract. I don't see it reading the contract, but apparently Paramount saw it that way.
That was a breach of the contract, that they didn't just get Max, they had to have Dave too? Was that correct, Ray?
When you go through the contract, actually, it's got a double whammy in it. First of all, this contract would not have held up because, in essence, during that 26 weeks, when they surrendered their ownership, in essence, Paramount ended up giving a contract to itself. Because the way the contract is written, Paramount owned the right to the name of the studio. They owned Fleischer Studios in name. They owned the assets. They even owned the names of Dave and Max Fleischer. It says so in the contract.
How they could let that happen is beyond me. Didn't they have lawyers?
Well, I don't know. I can't imagine a lawyer advising you to sign this, but the one thing they both Max and Dave had, and I say this with love, they had huge egos, and they felt that this was no big deal, that they could just go and start another studio anywhere and be successful. And my father tried to explain to them what they were doing. Other people tried to explain to them what they were doing.
They wouldn't listen.
But they wouldn't listen.
Yeah. Paramount already knew that there were these problems between the brothers. And all of these stories about death threats and so forth in order for Paramount to take over, that wasn't necessary because they had more than enough evidence that they were not performing. And there are plenty of clauses that repeat this issue about failure to perform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And they gave them ways of terminating the relationship. So if either one of them wanted to get out, they had to render a resignation 30 days before the expiration of this agreement. The 26 weeks was supposed to have been up in November of 1941. So from that point, May 27th of 1941, from that point on, folks, it's no longer Fleischer Studios. Paramount owned the name to Fleischer Studios, but it wasn't. It didn't officially become Famous Studios in name until the 27th of May 1942. But you may as well consider it Famous Studios the year before because of that contract.
Yeah. Very sad when you think about it.
That, but the end result was just something awful because Max and Dave both left, and Paramount sent in its people to run the studio.
Yeah.
And as far as my own family was concerned, as soon as Paramount assigned people to work with my father, figure out what he did, and then fire him. At which they did.
Lovely. But luckily he bounced back and continued and was a brilliant musician, as were you.
But the idea of the sing-alongs came from my dad, who did it in silent movies. They worked out a situation where they put the lyrics on a drum, and my dad had a baton that was all black, and except it had a white ball on the end, and he wore a black glove, and he would actually bounce the ball, and the drum would turn to the next set of lyrics, and he would bounce the ball on each lyric as it came by.
Has anybody here seen Kelly? King of the little white, my life, of the silvery moon. By the silvery
So we would gravitate to Max before anything else.
Dave was a slapstick comic. He was just a naturally funny person with a wild sense of humor.
Inkwell Images Inc. with a K. Never heard of them. Have you, Bernie?
Yeah, I think I have.
And gentlemen, it has been my privilege and pleasure to have you here. Ray, you're brilliant as always. Will you come back and see us again?
I've got to.
We have got so much more to talk about with what happened after the studio closed and what happened with Max and what happened with your dad,
Yes.
Bernie. We have to talk about Lou and with Dave going to Columbia and then going on. And Max had another lawsuit with television later on.
That's right.
Which he did or did not win. He did
win.
He did win. He won it again. So we'll talk about that on another day. It has been a joy and an honor to have both of you here. Ray, you as always, and Bernie, thank you so much for giving up your afternoon. Thank you, Ray Pointer.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bernie Fleischer.
I really enjoyed it.
And we'll see you next week, folks. Bye-bye.